I grew up on like 1,100 acre hippie commune sheep ranch out there. You know, if you were to get into shooting a stick bow and get into shooting a compound, I think that the average person is going to say that they enjoy shooting their stick bow more. So I get the question a lot, well, what should I start out with? Should I start shooting a longbow or should I start shooting a recurve? For me, the greater consideration is the shape of the handle. Instinctive shooting is, think about instinctive shooting as throwing a ball. So there's no sight. You're picking up your ball and you're looking at the person you're throwing it to, and you just, throw it. For a right-handed shooter, the string is going to actually kind of jump to the left as it comes off your fingers, and then it's going to start kind of this S-shaped oscillation by getting somebody to, to train you in shooting is money well spent. Hi, this is South Cox with the Western Bowhunter podcast, and you're listening to episode number 57 of Living Country in the City.
Y'all ready for your dose of flyover state spirit? Straight from the concrete jungle? Well, put down your latte and pull on your boots. It's time for Living Country in the City.
Hey, y'all, welcome to another episode of Living Country in the City. Before we get started, I just want to say a big thank you to my podcast sponsor, Sawyer. If y'all are looking for quality, reliable hydration or protection gear for your hunts, you really can't go wrong with Sawyer. They're a household name for a reason. They've been putting out great products for a long time. And, my personal favorites are their gravity water filtration systems for my camp water, as well as their scent-free bug sprays. I love using tarp tents and floorless shelters, and Sawyer definitely keeps all the creepy crawlies off of me. Also, a big thank you to all of my supporting listeners. Many of y'all are out there donating financially and helping cover the monthly costs that come with releasing a podcast. So go check out these fine folks, as well as find out how you can help out, especially if you want to see me start releasing twice a week, by visiting livingcountryinthecity.com/support. Even $1 a month. It really helps immensely, more than you know, and it comes with some cool rewards. And I mean, $1 a month, that is only $12 a year, and that's basically one cocktail or two coffees out here in LA. Just saying. Anyway, I also want to take a quick minute to talk to y'all about my good friends over at T3 Custom Game Calls, formerly Talkin' the Talk Custom Calls. Now, with spring turkey season right around the corner, y'all really need to be thinking about your calls, and there's no reason to not go for the absolute best. Every call from T3 is handcrafted with just a crazy amount of attention to detail and consistency. And on top of that, they do custom designs and orders by request. You absolutely cannot beat the quality of these turkey calls. And now, as listeners of the podcast, y'all can get 10% off all orders placed on the T3 website through March if you use the code LIVINGCOUNTRY. So get those orders in. Head on over to the website, t3calls.com. Also, give them a follow on Instagram, T3 Calls, and Facebook, T3 Game Calls. Don't just call at them, talk to them. Getting on to the show. Today, I'm talking trad bow hunting with the man behind Stalker Stickbows and the Western Bowhunter podcast, Mr. South Cox. Thanks for hopping on the show with me today.
Oh, hey, no sweat. It's always fun talking to, guys in the hunting field there, the hunting industry. And I've been, at it for a while, but I, at one time, just like everybody, was a newbie in it myself. So anything I can do to kind of help the guys that are starting out, or even, the guys that have been at it for a long time, I love sharing, stories, sharing tips, and, whatever insight I can help out with along the way.
Well, that's what I always say. That was really the whole reason I started this podcast, was almost solely as an excuse to be able to reach out to awesome people that I admire and I find interesting and say, hey, can I sit and pick your brain for, an hour?
Yeah. It's in those conversations happen all the time, every day, and it's a shame that more of those conversations aren't recorded and released on a platform like this. And that's the great thing about podcasting is pretty much any interest that you have, you can find a podcast on it.
I mean, how amazing would it be to just be the fly on the wall on everyone's hunting camp and just, be able to listen in on that, or, all these discussions at the expos and ATA and Sheep Show, and just the ones that were never recorded, that were just two guys, they run into each other, grabbing a drink or whatever it may be. They sit and talk for 45 minutes, and there's just something amazing in there that you could learn from. I mean, I think that's why I enjoy doing this so much, is being able to, I don't know, shine a light on those conversations you wouldn't normally see elsewhere.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, if you step back to when I was a kid and getting into bow hunting, into backpack hunting and all that, it's the ease and access of information and just the volume of information that's out there is it's almost mind-boggling compared to when I started out backpack hunting. I didn't even know that backpack hunting was a thing. I just knew that I needed to get further from the road than what I could get out there and back in a day. And so it was like, all right, well, I'll put a backpack on and I can get further out there and into less disturbed animals. So that's kind of how I got my start into it.
Well, so speaking of that, kind of what's your background? How did you really start getting into the outdoors?
Well, it's part of it was my upbringing, and part of it, my story is kind of how unlikely it is that I got into it from my upbringing. I was a son of hippie parents, in Northern California, and neither of them hunted. And so right there, they're more of the tofu eaters than the meat eaters. In fact, my mom was a vegetarian, growing up. And so, a good portion of my life, I didn't eat meat, and not by choice, but just by her choice. Right. So I think it actually kind of turned my interest more into be a carnivore than it did deter me from eating meat, really. But I can remember, as young as 3 or 4 years old, throwing rocks at birds and wanting to hunt, right? So when I was about 5 years old, I found an old wood recurve under a neighbor's house, and so that kind of started me down the road with archery. And I never really set that love aside. There was times I got into racing bicycles, BMX bicycles and stuff, that I wasn't as passionate as as I was the bulk of my life there. But I think I was about 13 when I got my first compound. And I mean, here's how not only ignorant, but how little information there was available. I thought that you could pull any one of the 3 strings and it would be a different draw weight, so I just got super lucky that the bow that I bought was, I was able to back off the limb bolts enough that I was able to, draw the thing back. And so that kind of got me started. And when I was 17, I did my first backpack, trip where I loaded a pack and I wanted to dive off further off the road than what I could. So, I mean, I didn't really have a mentor growing up. There were, particularly when I was young, it was just something I had a real, passion about, being a hunter myself. And I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, their animals were in no danger for certain. And, this was long before I knew about hunting licenses or anything like that. I just had, got a bow and arrow and went out, hunting. And then it wasn't until, I got older that I learned, and started subscribing to magazines and just devouring any information I could get on hunting. And I really actually wanted to be a rifle hunter, but my dad wouldn't let me have a rifle. And so the bow, I fell back to the bow. And then once I kind of got my first taste of success, I think I can't remember if I was 16 or 17 when I shot my first buck. And at that point it was, no looking back. And I started getting into backpack hunting in the wilderness areas there in Northern California. And I lived in California all the way up until last year. So 47 years I lived in California. So, I mean, I was at the other end of the state from you, thankfully. I didn't grow up in the city. I grew up, out there in the country but still, had the same politics in California to deal with that you guys down Southern California have.
Where in Northern California?
So I grew up between, my mom lived in Santa Rosa, about an hour north of San Francisco, or not in Santa Rosa. She lived west of Santa Rosa, but it was in a really rural, I grew up on like 1,100 acre, hippie commune sheep ranch out there. And then my dad had moved up to near Eureka and further up north there in California, about, I don't know, it's maybe 80 miles from the Oregon border or something like that. It's right there on the coast. So, and in both areas, I lived a good portion of my life. Well, no, pretty much all my childhood till I graduated from high school, most of the time with no electric power. PG&E was all solar power, and no flush toilets. It was outhouses and all that. So it was a really rustic upbringing that most people maybe more towards kind of the turn of the century kind of upbringing, really.
That's crazy. I didn't know a ton about your history with all of that, and that is super fascinating. I mean, and even just not quite to the extent of the super rustic upbringing, but it's always nice when I hear stories that I can identify with, and that you weren't the one that's running around with a 22 shooting squirrels growing up your entire life, with your parents that have hunted their entire lives, and your grandparents. And
sure,
because I'm sure you probably get the same thing. You interview a lot of these people and you hear their stories, and it's like, well, my dad got me into this, and I had him as a mentor through this, and he was there when I got my first buck, and my parents are both very supportive of all of my hunting endeavors. They get so excited when I go out, and we're doing some family vacation, and I'm planning on turning it into a hunting trip, and they're okay with it. But it was the same kind of thing. It wasn't our family. It wasn't something our family was into. So starting at a bit of an older age for me, and we both laugh about what you're saying about the compound bow. Not knowing which string to pull back.
Right.
But for someone that's never, it's a weird looking device.
Sure.
For someone that's not familiar with one, has never seen one used before, you pick up a compound bow, and that's not like an unheard of thing to think of. It's fun to laugh about, but unless you have someone in that store showing you exactly what to do, it's a very, I could see a lot of people identifying with that, not necessarily on the compound bow, but maybe there has to be, everyone's done something like that, I feel like, where, you whatever device or tool or thing, I used it backwards. Oh, I got some wind checker, and I poured it in my hand and threw it up in the air because that's how I thought you were supposed to use it, or whatever it was. I'm sure everyone has got some story like that out there.
Yeah, by all means. I think that, if you can laugh at yourself, it makes the whole learning curve a lot more enjoyable, because, if you get a little too wound up about doing things right, then it's not going to be near as fun.
And anybody that pretends like they've never made a mistake is got to be a liar, or who knows? They're a liar.
Yeah. I've been backpack hunting since well over 30 years now, and there's not a trip that I don't learn something new or have something pounded into my brain that I knew but just kind of took for granted, or chose not to bring that piece of equipment or set my tent up in that spot, or whatever it was. Maybe getting a little naive, or a little too relaxed and complacent.
Yeah, anybody that's listened to the podcast much, they know I'm the first one to admit that I've made more than my fair share of mistakes trying to figure this out. And I'm pretty sure I've managed full seasons worth of mistakes in each hunting trip, each single hunting trip. So
sure. Well, that's a great thing about, starting out, and the information that's available now is, you can listen to a podcast or read something, and kind of you have this massive knowledge in your head, and you go out and then you still make mistakes, and you make some of the mistakes that you already had heard or learned about. And then it's like, oh, okay, yeah, now I remember hearing that, and I can see how this applies, or what, what the reason was for that. And you can kind of shorten the learning curve, but at the same time have maybe an experience that might have taken 2 or 3 times of messing up for those gears to click. But then all of a sudden, now that you got all this, potential knowledge out there, then the solution is much more available.
Yeah, there's definitely a huge difference between hearing about something and actually experiencing it, whether that's, playing the wind or whatever that happens to be. But then when you have that knowledge, when you've heard it several times, when it finally does, it finally does click a lot quicker than I feel like you would if you're just shooting in the dark, if you will.
Right.
So, grow up in the hippie commune. You find this bow. You start bow hunting. What took you from there to starting Stalker?
Wow, that was a long road. Let me tell you. So,
a little big jump there.
Yeah. So, I dove in head first. Once I started hunting, I was hooked. In the beginning, I was only able to, take one, vacation week a year. And so every year that was definitely, my focus was bow hunting. It was a backpack hunt up in the, one of the wilderness areas in Northern California there. And then occasionally I was able to pry away for a weekend bonsai trip. So that was probably the first 7 years after I graduated from high school. That's what I was doing. I got in the construction field and, working 7 days a week doing that for the most part. And then I, try to bank my time for that. And then I went out on my own, got my contractor's license, and was able to kind of prioritize. At one point I realized that, I could work 24/7 the rest of my life, and you just have to block out with X's on the calendar and take, this is the time that I'm going to be going and doing, this, whatever that might be. And so I started taking, 2 weeks or 3 weeks and doing 2 and 3 hunts a year. I don't think I did my first out of state. No, my first out-of-state hunt was up in Oregon, and so I did that fairly early on. I hunted mule deer in 1988, shot a buck up there in Oregon, and that got my first taste of mule deer hunting. And we had a local archery shop down where I lived and worked, and that was every day that I had any free time, I was up there hanging out at the archery shop. And Larry Jones, a stickbow. He was actually, interestingly enough, a stickbow guy out of Eugene, Oregon. He started putting together movies under Wilderness Sound Productions, his production company. And so that was about the time that I graduated from high school. And so I got to start watching these videos on, old VHS tapes, and he did one on mule deer hunting. And that really primed my interest for hunting mule deer. And I had been, a lifelong blacktail hunter, which to me, I've hunted all the deer species, and blacktails to me are probably the toughest. Well, blacktail and coos deer, kind of goes one or the other, depending on I really haven't hunted blacktails up in Oregon, kind of in that thick rainforest type of country much. It's been pretty much all, Northern California, and I kind of tailor. Or did. I haven't hunted them up there in a few years now, but I would tailor the kind of country that I hunted to be most conducive to my style of hunting. So I really enjoy spot and stalk versus like up there in Oregon, it's primarily all tree stand hunting. And so I would look for kind of alpine country in the wilderness and would focus my efforts there where it's more open country and you could glass them up and then try to, put a move on them before they went and bedded in the thicker brush. And that's a characteristic of black-tailed deer, where they may be out feeding in the open, but then almost without exception, they'll go dive into a thick brush patch to bed for the day. Whereas mule deer, they're more likely to bed, under a rock or a tree or something with a lot more sparse cover, at least when they're still in velvet. And once they strip the velvet, then they become a whole different animal. But fortunately, most of the archery seasons fall in that early, at least the first half of the archery season, you can hunt them while they're still in velvet. So that I focused my efforts probably the first 5 to 7, 8 years on blacktail hunting with a little bit of mule deer hunting, just a small amount sprinkled in there. And then in 93, I think it was, I with a partner, I bought out that local archery shop that was there in town, and that unfortunately was a short-lived endeavor. It was basically a blind date business partnership, and my business partner was not the easiest kind of person to get along with, and I'm super easygoing and can get along with pretty much everybody, but this guy was I can't remember what position he had, but he's like a merchant marine on a ship, and he had a kind of high position, so he's used to bossing people around and really not having to answer to anybody, and so it was kind of a lopsided partnership that didn't last too long, but that got me further into the hunting industry, where I was going to some trade shows, and I met a guy, Lon Lauber, who was an outdoor writer and photographer, very prolific at the time. And chances are, if you saw wild animal pictures in a hunting magazine at that time, there was a better than average chance that it was, his work, and he did a lot of writing. And so he was trying to shoot, all 5 deer species. And fortunately for me, I hadn't shot a Columbian blacktail. So we kind of did some swapping where I wanted to go up and shoot a Sitka blacktail. So I took him out on a Columbia blacktail hunt, and then we really hit it off. And at that point, for probably the next 10 or 12 years, we did 2 or 3 hunts a year together. And during that time, I kind of played as photo model for him, and consequently got into a lot of hunting magazines, got lots of pictures in there, and then I started kind of doing some of my own writing there as well, and which eventually evolved into a staff position with Eastman's Bowhunting Journal, and I wrote for them. I think I started writing. My first article for them was on the second issue that they actually put out. So I wrote for Eastman's for years, and then that kind of got me further into the hunting industry, and I helped Cameron Haynes out with a book that he did on blacktail hunting, and kind of shared my California expertise in that section of the book, and and then let's see, it was probably close to 25 years that it was 20 years. So I graduated from high school in 87. And then in 2007, a friend of mine from Sacramento, or right just near Sacramento there, he had Stalker Stickbows. It was actually Stalker recurves back then. And he had started it up in the 80s there, and he had run it for maybe, 10 years or something. And then he got a job. He had 4 kids at that point, and was offered a position as a construction superintendent, and had the dream of pursuing building bows on one hand, and then the financial security of a salaried position with benefits and all that. And when you have that kind of commitment with a family, I don't blame him for taking the route of least resistance there. So he kind of shelved the bow business, and before he had done that, I had gotten a bow from him, and so I dabbled in traditional archery in the 20 odd years that I'd been bow hunting, up to the point where I got the phone call from him, and he said, "Hey, my wife needs my bow shop for her photography studio, and so she's leaning on me to sell it, and would something you'd be interested in doing?" And so it all kind of worked out. I had sold a rental at that point in time, so I had the money to burn, and so I bought Stalker recurves in 2007. It was pretty funny. I mean, I was, like I said, I dabbled in traditional archery, so it was no surprise, on how challenging to me, or how challenging hunting with a stick bow was going to be. I went in with my eyes wide open, and I asked Charlie when he had offered me the company, I said, "Well, what do you think about a Boyer building bows and and building stick bows, but hunting with a compound. And he laughed because I don't think it would go over too well. And so I was really nervous. I mean, my family loves to eat venison, and so I was, I had these visions of all these unfilled tags, and so I kind of started gradually in that transition from hunting with a compound to hunting full time with a stick bow. And honestly, I don't know when I bought the company if I ever really. I mean, at that point in time, I was still very active in my outdoor writing, and I knew a lot of my audience that I was writing to hunted with compounds, and I was a little bit concerned about how that transition was going to go. And then at the same time, I didn't want to be looking at the bottom of a freezer that, had no meat in it. So my first year, 2008, when I had the company, I backpacked into Colorado on a solo hunt, and I had my stick bow in my pack, and I had my compound strapped onto my pack. And my intention was to hunt elk with my stick bow and hunt mule deer with my I take that back. Hunt elk with my stick bow and mule deer with my compound. So I ended up, ironically, filling my tag on opening day, shot a mule deer with my stick bow. And so it was from there I realized, wow, I could really do this. And since 2008, I've shot at least one mule deer every year, knock on wood, with my stick bow. And I think it was only a couple of years before I actually set my compound down for good, and it's been no looking back. So that's kind of the long story of how that transition happened.
No, I'm obsessed with traditional archery. I love it because that was the one thing I grew up doing. Is like not in any sort of official capacity, but I got like a youth recurve or long, like I can't even honestly, I can vaguely picture it. It was neon yellow, but this youth compound or recurve, and not compound. What am I saying? But I remember shooting this thing and I loved it. It was, I swear, the most fun I used to have, and I was pretty good with it, but this was also back in the day when I'd go behind the archery bales and I'd collect every single arrow I could find. And I was shooting aluminum arrows and carbon arrows and wood arrows, and of all different lengths, some with one feather on them. It was a mess, but I loved it. And ever since then, I picked up my compound bow, and I'm not sure I could ever, I'll still go to the range now and again and throw down a few magazines, but I don't think I could ever really pick up my rifle the same way again since I started shooting my compound. And I'm almost afraid if I pick up a recurve right now. I mean, I've already made it hard enough on myself to take my first animal.
Sure.
If I pick up a recurve right now, I may never go back to the compound, because I remember how much I enjoyed it as a kid. And I think there's so many parts to it too. I think just in that, like, especially the bows I see, I follow Stalker Stickbows on Instagram, and the bows you make are just works of art. Like, they really are. And I think that's one of the just amazing, like, added things added to
the appeals. Yeah.
But so talking, I've really wanted to do an episode on traditional archery, just because I probably shouldn't, because now I'm gonna want to go out and buy one, and that's one more thing I shouldn't do. But I've been wanting to do an episode on traditional archery, and really just from a new hunter's perspective, how would you go, someone that doesn't know anything about recurves? How would they said, hey, I want to get started in traditional archery. What's my first steps here?
Well, before we even take that step, let's talk about the psychology just on hunting with a stick bow versus hunting with a compound versus hunting with a rifle. Just to touch on it, that if you start out hunting with the stick bow, you're kind of diving into the deep end of the pool as far as challenge and versus chances of success. It's not that it can't be done. I mean, it's something that guys do every year, and there's hunters that fill the larger percentage of their tags with the stick bow, than they leave tags unfilled. But it requires a lot of patience and a lot of experience, and not necessarily a lot of experience, but a lot of opportunities. And if you are hunting, let's just say you're hunting an area, public land, where there's kind of maybe deer numbers are few, and your opportunities for a shot, let alone animal sightings, are few. Your learning curve is going to be a lot longer, and your chances of success are going to be a lot fewer than if you have, let's say you start out on a piece of private property and you're hog hunting. I mean, to me, that's like the ideal animal to learn on is like on a pig hunt, where they aren't super spooky animals. Their eyesight isn't great. Their hearing is really good. Their sense of smell is unmatched. But if you keep the wind in your favor, you hunt them in the wintertime, after the vegetation has gotten wet from some rains, and you can be really quiet. You can get in close and get super close shots. Or even, going on a hunt down in Texas or something, buying a plane ticket, flying down there and hunting a ranch down there where there's lots of hogs. What you want is lots of shot opportunities. And for somebody that, I think a lot of it too, whether you're going to stick with it or not is going to depend on each individual's personality. If you have the kind of personality where you don't get easily dejected or deterred, and once you get your mind onto something, you're going to work hard until you succeed, then shooting a stick bow is a great option, because chances are it's going to be very frustrating in the beginning. There's going to be more failures than successes. And when I say failures, I don't mean it in a negative aspect. It's just you're not going to have as many successes in that if you're using it as a barometer, filled tags as the barometer, you're going to have lots of successes in that. You're going to have a lot of enjoyable experiences. And unbiasedly, I can say that, if you were to get into shooting a stick bow and get into shooting a compound and shoot, both of them, a similar amount of time, I think that the average person is going to say that they enjoy shooting their stick bow more. And when I'm out hunting, I'm constantly shooting my stick bow. I'm just walking around, picking out a leaf, picking out, a stick or whatever, and I'm shooting it. And I really enjoy that. And, when I had a compound, I didn't do that so much, because you're shooting an arrow a lot faster with a lot more energy, and you're breaking arrows when you're out there, shooting at sticks, instead of hitting just the stick, and you're burying your arrow in the ground and hitting the rock that's in the ground, right? So it's a lot harder on equipment. But if you can, if you're either the type of person that enjoys a challenge and is willing to stick it out, then shooting a stick bow is a great place to start. But if you are the kind of person that needs kind of more instant gratification, then I would start pick up a stick bow, start shooting it, but not necessarily maybe hunting with it, but start building that foundation of skill. Get a rifle tag, go put some meat in the freezer, get your feet wet, learn, what it's like being out there. You're going to learn about the animals. You're not going to learn to the level that you would with a compound or a stick bow, but you're going to enjoy, have a greater likelihood of enjoying success. Then transition to a compound. That learning curve is going to go back up again. You're going to have to learn more about animal behavior. You're going to have to increase your woodsmanship and your stalking skills and or tree stand placement or whatever it is. You're going to have to increase that knowledge about the species that you hunt. And then as you transition again from a compound to a stick bow, then that learning curve starts right back up again. And again, you're having to, increase that knowledge base. And if you just jump in and start right out with a stick bow, you don't have the benefit of, that time where, you got to learn about which way the wind blows with a rifle in your hand at 400 yards. All of a sudden now you're having to sneak 15 or 20 yards from an animal. And there's a lot of things to learn about, taking your boots off and proceeding forward with a couple pairs of socks on versus with a rifle. I mean, you can go out there wearing Cordura and nothing's going to hear you, when you're measuring your shot distance in hundreds of yards. Whereas, I mean, I'm so anal about the clothes I wear as far as how quiet they are and any, accessories or gear that I have on my body when I'm closing that final distance for the stalk, because if you're stalking a mule deer in its bed and it's the early afternoon and there's not really much for breeze, I mean, you can hear a fly buzzing at 20 yards and any rustle of your clothing is going to make noise. So I think that would be my bit of advice, starting out for the newbie guy. And as a manufacturer of traditional archery equipment, that might seem maybe not the best business move to be not encouraging somebody to start out with a stick bow right out the gate. But I'm interested in longevity in the sport over the long haul, because it doesn't do me or hunters any good, the whole greater hunting community, if we have people that are getting into hunting, starting out at the deep end of the pool, getting discouraged and then bowing out after a year or two. I want to see people that are successful in doing this, and whether your metric of success is filled tags or just great experiences, your first great experience in the field, it might be sneaking up on a buck, with a stick bow in your hand and blowing it out at 50 or 60 yards, and just that being the closest you ever gotten to an animal in the role of being a predator, with a bow in your hand. Or it might be that first great experience might be, shooting a buck at 300 yards and putting meat on the table. Each person's going to have a different, metric for that.
No, absolutely. You definitely, there's a lot of layers to hunting, and it's a lot easier when you just start easily peeling back those layers one at a time and not having to worry about trying to dig through all of them at once and get everything perfect with that stock, when maybe you've never stalked in on an animal before, period. Getting into 15, 20 yards is a lot different than getting into 100, and even getting into 100 yards presents piles of challenges. And it's definitely very wise advice. Not that I have totally taken that advice. I've been given that by several people.
Sure. Uh-huh. Yeah.
I have a tendency to throw myself wholly into the deep end when I do anything.
Sure.
I've realized that about myself.
I think a lot of us are like that. The people that get into hunting kind of get into it at a fanatical level, and it's not just like a passing interest. And those are the people, generally speaking, that are going to stick with it. And then, they're the guys that like to challenge, themselves and embrace that challenge. And for the guys that are like that, that want to start out shooting a stick bow, I don't want to deter anybody from it. That's for sure. And for those people, I think that probably the easiest way for me to make recommendations is for the guy that shot a compound a little bit. So, maybe he's got an idea of, okay, this is my maximum comfortable draw weight that I'm that I can shoot with a compound. So let's just say that that's 65 pounds, let's say, with a compound. Well, I recommend dropping, at least 15 to 20 pounds when you're transitioning from shooting a compound to shooting a stick bow. I think the biggest problem when you're starting out shooting a stick bow is overbowing yourself. Again, as a manufacturer of compounds, of stick bows, I think a good piece of advice might be, if you're interested in trying it out, or you want to do this, the first step might be go buy yourself a cheap Chinese made recurve that's maybe 10 pounds less than what you figure you can comfortably shoot, just so that you can start with that shoot and really work on your shooting form. And so maybe you buy a 40-pound Sage or Samick recurve, and you start out with that. You can pick one of those up for in that ballpark of $175, or you could pick one up used, probably off of eBay or something like that. I haven't really looked at it, but I'm sure you can, or Craigslist or whatever, or buy one off a Hunting Buddy, or go in on one with a Hunting Buddy. But in any case, something to get you started and get you started a foundation of good shooting form, because that's going to go a long ways. If you're struggling to hold that bow back at full draw, or even reach full draw, because the draw weight is what you have, this preconceived idea of what you need to have. Like, a lot of guys feel like there's a psychological barrier that I can't shoot less than 50 pounds with the stick bow, because it's just arrow's going to bounce off the animal or whatever it is. I mean, I went through that same thing when I transitioned from shooting a compound. I was really caught up in the speed craze, and so I shot a light arrow when I transitioned from shooting a stick bow. I was shooting probably a 420 grain arrow, something like that, and kind of around what I was shooting with my compound, and I got lucky with that mule deer that I shot, that that I got good penetration, and that I made a fatal shot on that buck. And now, my arrow weight is another 150 grains more than that. And it's not shooting as fast, but man, I got a lot more momentum, and those arrows are, blowing through both sides, almost everything I shoot at. But so my first tip would be, don't start out too heavy. Drop a minimum 15 to 20 pounds in draw weight. Even better to start out with a lighter bow there in the beginning. There's lots of good stuff on YouTube. There's another podcast that it's called the Push Podcast, and it's a traditional archery podcast. And the two guys there go deep into shot sequences and shooting form, and have a lot of guests on that podcast that are really good with traditional archery, and a lot of knowledge there on that podcast. So it's a great resource to listen to. They do some YouTube stuff as well. If you go to, if you think of this transition as far as, like, for me, as a Western hunter, even if I'm hunting within the state that I live now in Colorado, and I take off on an 8 or 9 day hunt, even though I'm buying resident tags, and you still have a lot of money kind of tied up as an investment into that hunt, into that experience, and getting, kind of investing early on in your quest, whether it be shooting a compound or shooting a stick bow, by getting somebody to to train you in shooting is money well spent. Denver, Colorado is pretty centrally located in the country. There's a fantastic archery shop there with a level 4 archery instructor, is trained at the Olympic Training Center, Tom Klum, and he does quite a few podcasts as a guest, and he's a partner with the guys there from the Push Podcast. And you can book a private lesson, or a series of private lessons with them. It wouldn't be a bad idea to fly into Colorado, into Denver, for the weekend, set up a couple of private lessons with him, or he does a hog clinic down in Texas, where you can actually go down. There's another shooting coach, Joel Turner, who does what is it, Iron Mind hunting, and yeah. So he teams up with Tom Klum, and Joel kind of does the mental side of the training, and Tom is more of the shooting form side of it. And so you can get a total immersion experience, go down, learn about shooting, learn how to be properly shooting, at the same time get a chance to go out there and hunt on, during this, I don't know if it's a 4 or 5 day week long kind of full immersion clinic that they do, but you get a chance to take what you're learning directly out into the field, apply it. And I think, for somebody that's starting out hunting, let alone starting out shooting, making that transition, what a fantastic resource to be able to learn from, because you're going to be learning about shooting. You're going to be learning about hunting. There's a lot of people there of all different skill levels that you can glean information from. But spend some money on yourself, learning. You wouldn't, go into a position as a CEO without having, kind of a college background to begin with. And if you think about, investing in a mentor, investing in a teacher, then this is kind of a similar background. Get an education in what you're doing. A lot of it is, you can learn from podcasts like this, but you can't beat some hands-on instruction for sure.
No, absolutely. Just like anything with hunting, is all the theoretical knowledge in the world is great, but when the rubber meets the road and you're actually out there trying to do something, it may click a lot faster than it would if you didn't get all that knowledge, but it's never going to be the same thing as some good, straightforward, hands-on instruction.
Right. Now and kind of taking that next step. So if a guy is interested in starting out shooting a stick bow, there's basically longbows and recurves, and so I get the question a lot. Well, what should I start out with? Should I start shooting a longbow or should I start shooting a recurve? And to me, the option is, for one, some guys are just drawn to like the lines, the physical lines of a longbow, and that's what appeals to them. And for sure, if you are going to get greater pleasure, greater enjoyment out of that, by all means, start out with a longbow. There's nothing wrong with going that route. For me, the greater consideration is the shape of the handle. And a lot of like the older or kind of the English style longbow or Howard Hill style longbow, they kind of make more of a D shape when the bow is strung. They'll have like a kind of a suitcase style handle where you just grab onto it, somewhere right below the shelf and where the arrow sits there. And those, in my experience, are more challenging to shoot accurately and consistently than if you were to start out shooting a bow, whether it be longbow or recurve, with a more defined kind of pistol grip shape to it, where your hand is going to be forced into, that grip location consistently from shot to shot. And that's, a big part of shooting, whether it be a gun, a compound, or a stick bow, is doing the same thing over and over again. It's that repetition and consistency. So I like to start guys out shooting, kind of that defined pistol grip shape. Whether you have longbow limbs attached to it or recurve limbs attached to it is almost a moot point. Then, again, don't shoot more draw weight than what you're comfortable shooting. And the only way you're really going to know that is by, if you have that experience shooting a compound, if you kind of use that 15 to 20 pounds less as a gauge, then that's a great way to start. Or go down to your local archery shop or local archery club or range. And trad guys are, for the most part, really friendly people. And if you ask to shoot a handful of guys' bows almost without fail, then people are going to not have a problem with it. Whereas, maybe with a compound, there'd be a little bit more concern about, plus with a compound, if you're a 29-inch draw length, then you can't let a guy who's a 27-inch draw length try out your bow. It's just, it's not going to work. Whereas a stick bow, the further you can take a guy that's got a bow that, maybe he had it made so it's 50 pounds at 28 inches, but a guy that's drawn 26 can still shoot that bow. It's just going to be a little bit less draw weight, usually in that 2 to 3 pounds per inch. So if you have a bow that says 50 pounds at 28 inches and you draw 29 inches, then you figure you're going to be about 2 to 3 pounds heavier than that 50 pound, rated draw weight. Conversely, if you have a 26-inch draw length, you're going to be, 4 to 5 pounds lighter in draw weight. So you can get a chance then to shoot, if you go into an archery club is a great way, because, you could shoot a handful of different guys' bows maybe, and then get a chance to feel what kind of draw weight is comfortable for you, and then also what grip and what bow manufacturer might work out best for you, because you can't necessarily, one bow, any bow that I make is not necessarily going to be the answer to every archer out there. One guy is going to shoot, maybe one bow within my bow line better than another. And it gets down to that where, you might be able to pick up all of the bows I make and shoot them equally well, but some people, it might be that one bow particularly works best for them. And so, getting a chance. There's another great reason to go to Rocky Mountain Supply there in Denver. They have, at any given time, they'll have plus or minus 500 used bows there in their shop. It's got to be by far the biggest selection of used bows in the country. So you can go there and shoot yourself silly trying out all these bows, used bows there, and it's a great way to get into it too, without spending all the money for buying a full custom bow to begin with. So, fantastic resource there. And then there's scads of people that work there, and all of them are passionate about traditional archery. All of them fantastic for helping out the newbie. And again, if you're talking about a $250 investment in a plane ticket to fly out there to Denver and go visit, a shop like this, it's a great resource to get you headed out down the right track. You might drop a $800 or $1,000 on a custom bow that really is appealing to you, only to find out that it is not the right bow for you. So, you think about that investment of $250 in a plane ticket and flying out there and burning a little bit of your own free time, and to get started in the right place. It's a kind of a no-brainer, really.
Well, and it's not like it's exactly a chore either.
No, no.
Oh, darn, I need to fly out to Colorado and go shoot all these bows and hang out with these awesome people and learn about hunting. Twist my arm, why don't you?
For sure. Yeah. No, it's great. And I'm, an hour and a half from Denver. So while you're at it, take an extra few hours to drive up to Estes Park and visit my shop, and you shoot some more bows here too. So.
Oh, no, definitely. That's, it's always interesting. I think with anything, you talk about not trying to overdo it with your first bow and finding the draw weight that's right for you. I think that really applies to whatever you're using. You don't start out. I think I'm drawing 70 pounds on my compound right now. When I started out, I think I was barely able to pull 50. I think I dropped it down to about 45. Mm-hmm. And if I had been trying to pull back at 65, 70 at that time, I not only would I have been maybe able to get the bow back once a day, I would not have enjoyed it.
Right.
When I started shooting, I did not start shooting with a 30-06, bolt action.
Sure.
I started shooting with a, little semi-auto Ruger 1022.
Yeah.
Because it eliminates all those extra issues that you have to worry about otherwise. You're not worried about the kick of the gun when you've never really shot before. Starting off smaller is not is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of intelligence, I think.
100%. That was very well put right there, because I mean, it's so easy to get your ego involved in, the specs on your bow. I mean, I shot through the late 80s. I shot, 85 pounds with my compound, because that's what, all the other manly guys did. Right. And I guarantee you, I did not shoot it as well as I could have had I been shooting, in the 60s or 70s, in draw weight. And, it's pretty interesting. I look back on so the guy that I bought the business from, when you're building bows, you keep track of basically it's like a log of all the specifications that go into the limbs when you're gluing them up, and that's all the draw weights and bow lengths and all that, and so keep in mind this is back in the 80s when he was building them, and in early 90s, and I'll look at the draw weights and they'll be, I mean, almost without exception, it'll be 55 to 65 pounds. And now the average draw weight that I build on the bows that, I'm selling to customers are probably between 48 and 53 pounds. And so you think about, that's like a 12 to 15 pound weight reduction. And I think that people are just kind of getting smarter about that you don't need that much draw weight. And it's more important to place the arrow accurately than it is to have a ton of power, behind that arrow. And because, I mean, if you don't hit the animal, it doesn't matter how fast your arrow is going, right?
I mean, you might take down some trees, but it's not going to fill the freezer.
Yeah, I mean, you get your arrow, you get your broadhead buried deeper into the tree trunk, and it's harder to dig back out again. I've done that many times.
And we'll just leave that one there for the season.
Right.
I've definitely where I shoot up at my folks' place, there's a big old just pile of firewood behind it, and there's been a few times where I've been a bit closer, and I've really considered how much effort that arrow's worth.
Right.
I look at it, I'm like, wow, that's gonna be a good half an hour to chop that thing out of that log.
Yeah, when I was younger and my budget was smaller, I would expend a great deal of energy, trying to get my broadheads and back out of dead logs and what have you, and oftentimes at the expense of my arrow, where you'd be wiggling the shaft back and forth trying to loosen the broadhead up, and then end up snapping off the aluminum shaft. I mean, this was, back in the day before carbons were around. So, it was something else.
Okay, let's take a minute there just to hear a quick word from one of my partners. All right, y'all. So we know that there's countless box club offers out there catering to all different kinds of people and interests, from fishing to shaving, exercising, skincare, and whiskey. Just about anything you could think of. But none of them ever really appealed to me until I came across a newcomer to the arena, Bowhunter Box Club. Bowhunter Box Club is the only subscription box club service out there geared specifically for bow hunters. And I mean, who doesn't love getting a box packed full of awesome new bow hunting gear delivered directly to their doorstep every month? Now here's the deal. Each month they'll deliver a box filled with around $60 to $70 worth of awesome new products and gear for you to try out. Previous boxes have included gear such as broadheads, bino adapters, stands, gear hoists, and bow slings from companies like Vortex, Phone Scope, and Boning. This is quality gear that you've either been wanting to try out or really didn't know you needed. Now you can choose from a bunch of different subscription plans that'll fit your budget. You can go month to month or save even more by selecting a long-term prepaid subscription. On top of that, for a small annual fee, you can join their VIP Pass-Through Club. Pass-Through Club members get exclusive access to buy discounted bow hunting gear that won't fit in the monthly box. What's even better is you're entered into monthly giveaways for incredible bow hunting gear like a Matthews bow or a Vortex spotting scope package. They're even giving away hunts. Now the best part is you can get 10% off your first month of any subscription plan by using code COUNTRY10. And you can get $10 off the VIP Pass-Through Club membership by using code COUNTRYVIP. Get both of those codes and more discounts from awesome outdoor companies by visiting my partners page at livingcountryinthecity.com/partners.
But anyway, going back to, kind of equipment and shooting and what have you, just to kind of further along that transition or that introduction into traditional archery. I think so. Assuming okay, now you got your bow, and the next thing is, you for one, you need to have arrows fletched with feathers if you're going to be shooting your stick bow off the shelf. And by off the shelf, with the compound, you have that same or similar shelf right above your hand, but your arrow doesn't sit on the shelf, it sits on an arrow rest. And with some of the metal handled recurves that are available, you can like put a stick-on rest onto the side of the riser there on that strike plate, and then shoot off an elevated rest. But with a wood-handled recurve, almost without fail, most all of them are set up to shoot off the shelf. So your arrow is sitting directly, not directly on the wood shelf, because there'll be some kind of pad there, whether it be out of leather with some hair on it or just tanned leather or another material there. So your arrow sits there on the shelf, and so you need feathers that are going to collapse as they touch the shelf on the way past it, heading down range. Whereas a plastic vane, when it hits that shelf, a feather is going to give and deflect there, whereas a plastic vane doesn't have that much flex to it. So then you're going to get some terrible arrow flight coming out of the bow. So if you're shooting off the shelf, you definitely want to be shooting feathers versus vanes. So that's your first thing. As far as selecting arrow spine with a compound, typically speaking, the compound bows are a little bit more tolerant of arrow spine than stick bows are. And this is going to go into just barely touch on tuning, because you could have a whole multi-part series podcast on tuning arrows, but I'll just kind of barely touch on it a little bit here, just so that people kind of get an introduction to the concept. When you are shooting with your fingers, as that string leaves your fingers, that string doesn't come straight off your fingers. What happens is, as your fingers relax, that string is wanting to pull out of your fingers. So it's actually going to kind of, if for a right-handed shooter, the string is going to actually kind of jump to the left as it comes off your fingers. And then it's going to start kind of this S-shaped oscillation as it travels towards the resting position, where the bow is, where the string lays before you start drawing it. That's called brace. Or so as your string travels back towards brace, then your string is actually kind of starting out, jumping to the left and curves back to the right, and then travels back to the left again. So what happens is you're slamming the back end of that arrow with the bowstring as it's pushing it out of the bow. And because that force is exerted, as it's leaving your fingers, it's exerted to the left, it's going to bend your arrow. Because all that force is put on the back end of your arrow, it's going to actually bend the middle of your arrow one direction. And then as the string corrects and then overcorrects and goes back to the right again, then it's going to apply forces in the opposite direction to your arrow. So your shaft is flexing like crazy coming out of your bow. And it's important to match the stiffness or spine of the arrow with the amount of force that's being pushed behind that arrow. So you couldn't take a weak spined arrow and shoot it at a heavy draw weight, because you're applying so much force that thing's going to bend like a noodle coming out of there, and it's not going to recover well. And then if you shoot a lightweight bow with a really stiff spined arrow, what's going to happen is that arrow is not going to flex very much. And as that string pushes it forward, it's actually going to slam that shaft into the side of your bow there. So it's pretty interesting. If you looked up like slow motion arrow release, or say arrow deflection, you can watch some. It's actually pretty scary and intimidating, because man, that arrow comes out of there like a limp noodle as it comes out of your bow there, and it's pretty incredible to watch those slow motion videos. But you want to match the spine of your arrow with the weight of your bow, and fortunately there's what are called spine charts. So if you go to, say, Gold Tip Arrows or Easton Arrows like that, to their website, then there's spine charts that'll get you in the ballpark of which spine you should be using. And that's going to be determined not only by your draw weight, but also your draw length and the point weight. So the heavier the point weight you have, the stiffer the arrow spine you need. And so that, is something to keep in consideration, that if you're going to shoot 125 grain broadhead, then if you all of a sudden change to 200 grain broadheads, then you effectively made that arrow spine weaker, because when you push on the back end of that arrow, you have more weight up front that arrow, that inertia has to overcome. So it's essentially, if you took think of it as this: if you took a soda straw and you put the end of it against a wall, a fixed object, and you pushed on the other end of it, obviously that wall is not going to move, and you're going to bend that soda straw. Now, if you put that same soda straw up against something that would move with less force, then that soda straw is not going to bend as much before that wall starts to move. And so essentially, by adding more weight up front, what you're doing is you're making it harder to get that arrow to move. So that arrow is going to bend more with a heavier weight out in front. And conversely, with a lighter point, then that arrow is going to bend less, and so you don't need as stiff of a spine to get good arrow flight with a lighter arrow. So again, that's kind of diving in, maybe even a little bit further than I intended to, but there's a ton of information out there about bow tuning. So let's assume that you have your arrow spine matched to your bow, or pretty close, so that you can kind of tune out some of the problems that you might, or tune out the discrepancy you have in arrow spine to your bow. Next step is, okay, am I going to shoot split finger or 3-under? My suggestion for guys that are starting out is to shoot 3-under. So what that means is that when you nock your arrow on your string, your finger placement is either going to be, typically there's other options too beyond split finger or 3-under, but if you go split finger, you're going to be putting one finger on top of the arrow, above the arrow on the string, and then two fingers below the arrow. And if you're shooting 3-under, you're going to be putting, as the name implies, you're going to be putting all three fingers under the arrow. So what that does is, if you're shooting 3-under, when you draw back and you touch your anchor point, where, say, you put in your top finger at the corner of your mouth there, what that does is that puts that arrow higher up, so that you are essentially more like looking over the barrel of a shotgun. So you can use that point of your arrow as a reference, left and right, and then, okay, I need to hold my arrow, let's say, at the bottom of the brisket, or at knee level on a 3D deer target, and then my arrows will hit where I'm aiming at 15 or 20 yards or whatever. Whereas when you're shooting split finger, that arrow is lower, and so that tip of your arrow is less in your peripheral vision, and it becomes more challenging to consistently hit the target. And then so we go from split finger or 3-under into two different shooting styles, as far as instinctive or gap shooting. And instinctive shooting is, you think about instinctive shooting as throwing a ball. So there's no sight. You're picking up your ball and you're looking at the person you're throwing it to, and you just throw it. And if you think about all the times when you're a kid about the ball going all over the place, and then after a while, then through muscle memory and your brain subconsciously computing, if you're throwing the ball to a guy 10 yards away or 30 yards away, then you don't think about, okay, I have to hold, or I have to make the ball arc this much more. You just pick up the ball, you look at where the person is, and you throw the ball to them. Well, that's what happens with instinctive shooting. It takes a while to master and to kind of program your brain, but what you're doing is you're looking at the spot you want to aim at. You are subconsciously judging that distance. You're drawing back the bow. You're focused on that spot. You release the arrow, and holy cow, it hits. Well, that took a while to accomplish that, but after enough shooting, then you can program your brain to do that. Shooting with a gap shooting method, you're using the tip of your arrow as a reference to the target. So out to what's called your point on, where your point of your arrow, you could use that essentially like a sight pin. So like my point on is about 40 yards shooting with the gap shooting method. So about 40 yards, I know that I can draw back and I can put the point of my arrow where I want to hit on the target, and my arrow is going to arc in and hit there. But at 20 yards, I have to actually be the point of my arrow is below the animal, and I will have an idea of, okay, at 20, and I don't do this consciously. I don't, think, okay, the animal's at 22 yards, so my arrow needs to be 10 inches below. I just have it kind of, again, it's somewhat instinctive kind of gap style. And I will draw back. I'll line up my arrow left and right, under the animal or the target or whatever. And then I'll cut my shot, and, it'll go in there, assuming that I, did all the mental calculations properly. There are a lot of guys that are transitioning from shooting a compound that are gap shooting, and they're using a rangefinder. So they've spent the time at the target range where they know, okay, at 20 yards, my point of my arrow's this far under the target. And so they'll use a rangefinder and they'll determine it. And then they're able to, shoot very effectively that way. I know quite a number of people that do that.
So I've also had some people that tell me, and it could just be that they're doing it completely wrong, but that rather than using the tip of their arrow as a reference, they have certain like mental spots on their riser that they use as a gap, almost kind of like pins on a compound site, where they're like, okay, this little nick on my riser, that's where I aim at 20, that this little swirl in the wood is where I aim at 30.
That's not something I've played around with, but I could see how that could work. You'd need to be shooting your bow in kind of a more traditional vertical style, in order to be able to do that. I shoot my bow canted, so it's the bow as I draw it back is kind of at an angle, not vertically. In a vertical position. And what that does by canting the bow is it kind of clears out the side of the bow, the sight window of the bow out of my sight picture. It kind of opens everything up, and it might seem totally foreign to a guy shooting a compound where you're shooting a bubble level and you're wanting to make sure your bow is perfectly plumb, or you're going to be shooting left or right, versus when you're shooting canted style, then it is very contrary to what you spent so much time learning shooting a compound. But personally, I shoot mine canted, so at that point, any marks on the riser would be of no use at that point.
And I think if I remember correctly, the people that were doing this was at like an intro to archery class or something at one of the local ranges. And, it was very much like, okay, you hold your bow straight up and down. And this is how you, and so I think that's where it was. So it was a very much a more like, okay, this is very proper and perfect, exactly how you do it. And most of these people weren't hunters. They're not, they're just shooting at Vegas faces.
Sure.
So slightly different environment as well, I'd imagine.
Yeah, a lot of the target guys that are really into the target shooting shoot a vertical, with vertical form. And I haven't really played around with it that much myself. I just find that canting my bow works very effective in a hunting scenario, and so that's the way I've always done it myself.
No, definitely. So we touched on a little bit of this, but what are some of maybe the top 3, I guess, challenges when it comes to shooting a stick bow? We talked a little bit about getting in closer and just adding to that difficulty, but maybe more specific in that, what are some of the biggest challenges you encounter shooting a stick bow over a compound or even a rifle?
Well, I don't have a lot of experience shooting a rifle to base that on, but I can tell you, my greatest challenge with shooting a stick bow is holding it together, at the time of the shot. And I think I could say that with just about anything that I've shot with, but with a stick bow, it's probably even more so. With a compound, you have the advantage of, you have all of these physical draw checks or mental crutches, for lack of a better word. I don't want to say it's a crutch like it's a negative thing or impaired thing, but it's, you have a sight pinned, you have a kind of a draw stop, with dropping into the valley of the bow. You have, all these things that you can kind of depend on to help you shoot more consistently.
There's very defined
exactly
points through the process.
Right. So even, when you draw back, boom, you're hitting the same draw length every time versus a stick bow. I've seen tons of guys that can shoot, consistently on the shooting range. They draw back, they get excited, they might short draw their bow, or they might overdraw it where they're drawing back further. And, of course, short drawing it is going to change the trajectory of your bow because you're not putting as much power behind the shot, and overdrawing it conversely is going to make your arrow shoot flatter. So that both of those scenarios will totally mess with the trajectory of your arrow. Not to mention how it'll come off the bow when you shoot it. So those are two things right away. Being disciplined in picking a spot with shooting a stick bow. So it's easy. And this can happen on the target range too. It's easy just to look at the bale and shoot at the bale versus, picking out that piece of hay that you want, that individual piece of hay that you want to hit. Whereas even with a sight pin, you can still do that. You can kind of black out and shoot at the whole animal. But with that sight pin, you have a fixed reference point. So, when you draw back and you anchor, you're looking through a peep sight, you're centering the pin within the peep sight, and then you're lining up that pin on what you're shooting. Whereas shooting a stick bow, man, it is so easy just with, all of the distractions, getting in close to an animal and you get excited and it's like, oh man, I have to, get this shot off before that buck steps out or blows out or whatever the scenario is. And you come back to full draw and you look at the animal instead of looking at that small spot that you want to hit. I think that's probably the biggest challenge, even, to this day for me, is remembering to pick that tiny spot that you want to be hitting, remembering to aim, because it's not forced with that, like you have that sight pin to rely on. So I think that's, probably the biggest thing for me. That's even more so than getting close to the animal, is remembering in the heat of that moment to pick that spot.
So then on the inverse, what's, as a hunter, what's the best part about shooting a trad bow, would you say? What's your favorite part? What really draws you in?
Oh man, when it all comes together, the feeling of success when I think the more you have invested into anything, and this can be universally applied across life, the more you have invested into something, when it comes together, it's the greater feeling of accomplishment. And if you tip a deer over at 300 yards with a rifle, maybe you're definitely going to, and I would too, I would feel elated and excited, and for sure, you're justified in that. But when you've, beaten all their senses and you've closed into 5 or 10 or 15 yards and, drawn back your stick bow and release that arrow without the benefit of release aid, without the benefit of, that defined stopping point, with the valley of your compound, without the stabilizer, without the rangefinder without all these added benefits. And again, I don't want to come across as some kind of purist. I hunted with a compound for years, and most of my hunting partners shoot compounds. But I can tell you from my personal experience that when it all comes together with a stick bow, it's like no feeling that you've ever had before, when compared to shooting with any other weapon. I mean, I haven't killed anything with a spear, but that would be next level, beyond shooting, beyond punching a tag with my stick bow, I'm sure.
I mean, I'm ready for the you sneak up on the elk with a knife and just slit its throat. Mm-hmm. That's the next level, even past that, right?
yeah, that's a little too close for my comfort there.
Oh man, just jump out of the tree stand on the deer and wrestle it to the ground. That's the other one.
Right. Right.
So everyone's say you've tested out all the bows, the style you want, you know the weight, all of that. Say somebody loves your bows, wants to come buy a Stalker Stickbow. What's the best way to purchase a bow from you?
So, if you're a newbie getting into it and you wanted to buy a bow from me, you can order it on my website, but I'd prefer to, stop what I'm doing, take the time to have a phone conversation and make sure that I get you what you want versus you taking a stab at trying to, guess on a few things. So picking up the phone is the best way. On my website is all my contact information at stalkerstickbows.com. And also you can reach out to me on social media, on Facebook at, stalkerstickbows.com. Same with Instagram, and contact me that way. And we can set up a phone call, or just, out of the blue, call me is fine. But like I said, I'd rather call somebody or have somebody call me and then talk the way through all the wood choices, draw weight, bow length, all those details there, so that I can make sure that the bow I'm building you is going to be the best fit possible for you.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure to link to all your social pages and the website on the show notes page. That is going to be livingcountryinthecity.com/57 for episode 57. And you've got some, I'm looking at the website here, and you got, some great content on here too. You've got section for someone new to stick bows. You got all these tuning and aiming tips, lots of video resources, and then just the pardon the term, but recurve porn all over the website, man.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I knew that this was going to be a good and a bad idea for me doing this podcast.
Right. Huh?
It's already tough. Anytime I would walk into the bow shop. I look at those recurves, and it's that mental, I'd have to scold myself. No, you've already got too much to worry about right now. Take that on once you feel a lot more comfortable with all the other aspects. So I not jumping those layers at the moment, but man, do I want one.
Yeah. Talking about just like hunt opportunities, I kind of already outlined doing a hog hunt or something like that. But another great kind of lower stress way of introducing yourself into traditional archery from a hunting standpoint is, if you go, say, back east on a whitetail hunt, most of the states offer doe tags. And a great way to do that is, hey, bring your compound back for filling your buck tag, and then pull out your stick bow when you're ready to shoot a doe and try and make that happen. Or even in some of the Western hunts have doe opportunities, and take some of the pressure off by making, doing an antlerless hunt and kind of get your feet wet that way. And it's not, you don't have as much at stake or as much invested necessarily as, from a financial standpoint or stress level or whatever. And shooting, going on an antlerless hunt is a great way to kind of transition into traditional archery.
Well, and I think you could also, an awesome option would be doing something like Total Archery Challenge or some,
Sure.
and you may not be you may not be lobbing those 100-yard shots with the stick bow, or those.
Right. Uh-huh.
You may not be doing with that 140 win a truck shot either, but that's another low pressure way that it's not an actual hunting trip, but yeah, maybe you do you do pick up that that less expensive bow and you take it out to somewhere like that, and you really get a feel for it in a situation that's not shooting at a hay bale, and you have a little more pressure and you learn a few more of those things before you pick up a brand new one. But so now that we're winding down, we've hit a lot of awesome advice for newbies, but just in general, when it a little more general, not specifically with traditional hunting or trad bow hunting, but if somebody came to you, said, Sal, I'm from the city, I don't have a background in this, or I'm just a new hunter, I don't have access to all these resources. There's so much to learn, so much to figure out. I'm too intimidated to do this. What would you say to that person?
I'd say take baby steps. For one, getting into hunting, if you look at social media and you open up the pages of a hunting magazine, you might feel like you need to be wearing the latest and greatest and clothing, and you might need to, buy this $2,000 set of optics, and then you got to buy a bow that's $1,000-$1,200, and then dump another $1,500 in accessories onto it. And what I would remind people is that if you go back to where I started, back in the 80s, and the equipment that was available then versus what's available now, you could go to Craig. Well, this stuff that I hunted with wouldn't even make it onto Craigslist. People would just be throwing the stuff away, right? So you can start out with, a 5-year-old compound that you acquire used, and you don't necessarily have to be wearing camouflage clothes. Just find something that's quiet, something that's going to keep you warm in the elements, and shop Craigslist for your backpacking gear if you're going to go that route. Because if you tried to start out in hunting and go all in and buy all the new greatest stuff, man, you're gonna be probably north of 10 grand just to kind of get outfitted to get out the door, and you could easily be 20K into it. So start your investment. My advice would be start your investment with some used gear to get your feet wet and to get out there, because it's more important to get out there and start accumulating experiences than it is to go out with all the right gear, because all the right gear is not going to fill your tags. It's what's going on between your ears that's going to make the difference for the most part. Yes, will all the nicest clothing make you more comfortable and more effective on the mountain? It will, but it's not going to bridge the difference between you working 51 and a half weeks a year so that you can afford it and going out for 3 days versus working 50 weeks a year, going out with some used gear and having 2 weeks to try to get it done in. I would start out, this is kind of the slant of a backpack type of a hunt, right? Or getting off the road type. Because if you are camping in a campground and doing some small hunts where you can walk in and walk out, that's probably the better way to start than to try to get all your gear and go for a 7-day, backpack trip if you've never spent an overnight in the mountains, let alone, that type of a immersion. I would start out slower. My first backpack trip, I left, I was campground hunting. There was a spot I wanted to go to, and it was further than I could get in and out in one day. So I loaded up a backpack. I got, down off the mountain, and I was 17 years old or something, and 16 maybe, I can't remember. And started getting dark, abort, because I was not comfortable being out there by myself, overnight. So if you think about trying to do a multi-day or a week-long hunt and trying to do this solo, and you've never spent a night in the woods by yourself, man, that can be an intimidating experience. And so I would get your feet wet first by making smaller forays. You could even start doing this preseason. Go out, do a scouting trip, do an overnight bonsai weekend trip where you're not burning any of your vacation time, and go out there. It'll get a chance give you a chance to test out gear, get to know your gear, start to learn your field craft, become more experienced at getting out there in the woods and spending time, there. And then when you are going to burn a week of vacation time, then you've already got some of this experience in the bank that will directly apply to your hunt and your hunting, so that you're not trying to learn everything all at once. You're not trying to learn how to glass for deer and how to set up your tent on the same trip. So I would say, start out slower, take your baby steps, and don't run a marathon for your first foot race.
Definitely. And I live in Los Angeles. I'm about as surrounded by city as it comes, but I can still, an hour drive, a 45-minute drive, I can still be away from the roads, find somewhere to set up my tent, and yeah, there may be a 0 to none likelihood of me seeing anything if I sat up there and glassed, but it's about, once again, it's about taking off one of those layers in a simple way, and like you said, learn how to set up your tent and not have to worry about all that other stuff at the exact same time. And just find out if you have an aptitude for it.
Yeah.
Get used to getting up, getting your gear set up and then getting up before the sun, and pick a spot on the map and say, okay, yes, I understand I'm not going to see any deer, actually see any deer glassing, but you know what? I want to look at that and say, this is the point I want to get to. This would be, quote unquote, my glassing point. And so I'm going to get up before the sun. I'm going to try and get there, and I'm going to see what that takes. And I think those are super valuable experiences. And yeah, it may not be the best hunting spot, but it's a great spot to test gear and test yourself and train yourself for those experiences. For sure.
I mean, all those, that's a great, great bit of advice there. If you're trying to learn about, how to navigate, where to set up to glass and what a bit of country looks like, on Google Earth versus, boots on the ground, and you're trying to do all of this at one time and do this all, on a week-long hunt, there's a greater likelihood that you're going to get discouraged and decide to pack it in than if you've spent, a couple of weekends pre-season ironing out some of these wrinkles and figuring some of this stuff out. And then, then you're going to, there's a greater chance that you're going to, spend that full 7 days out there in the field. And then, and greater chance, the odds stack towards the hunter the more time you're in the field. And so if you go out for 7 days but only hunt 2 of those days, you just decreased your odds by that much, versus if you go that full 7 days and you have those experiences to build on, that foundation to build on, from those earlier trips where you now know how to build a fire, in the rain, where to gather dry, wood to dry yourself out, where to set your tent up so it's not getting blown over or the conditions are miserable, or you got excessive tent, condensation. You're going to be more comfortable in the elements, being more comfortable out there, in the hills, than if that first foray is a first for all these other things that you could, be gaining experience from, even if you're not, in the field with a weapon in your hand.
Absolutely. So just to reiterate, stalkerstickbows.com to find you online. Got all the contact info up there. Stalker Stickbows on Instagram, right?
Yep.
yeah, I'll link to those on the show notes page, livingcountryinthecity.com/57, and we'll get this up. Thank you so much for taking the time this morning, hopping on the show with me.
No sweat, man. It's my pleasure. It was a great conversation.
All right, y'all, that'll do it for episode 57 of Living Country in the City. Make sure y'all head on over to our show notes page at livingcountryinthecity.com/57. I've got links there to Stalker Stickbows and the Western Bowhunter podcast. Make sure you go give South a follow online. Also, make sure y'all head on over to my support page at livingcountryinthecity.com/support. Really, even $1 a month helps out more than you know. I appreciate y'all, but in the meantime, keep it country, y'all.
Thank y'all for listening to Living Country in the City. Get show notes and check out the blog, product reviews, events, and more at livingcountryinthecity.com.
Hang on a sec here. I got an interruption here.
No worries.
I forgot to forewarn my wife that I was recording a podcast.
She looked pretty shocked coming in.
Yeah.
She was like, "Oh."
Yeah.